My name is Elena Vasquez, and I am 34 years old. My father died on a Tuesday in March. By the following Friday, his wife had filed paperwork to claim the entire estate, the house I grew up in, the savings account he had been building since before I was born, and the small landscaping business he had spent 30 years turning from a truck and a lawnmower into something real. I found out from the family attorney, who called me because my father had listed me as a co-beneficiary in a will he had written 7 years earlier, a will that Margaret, his wife of 4 years, had apparently decided was no longer relevant. I want to be clear about what I knew about Margaret Vasquez before my father got sick. I knew she was strategic. I knew she had appeared in his life 18 months after my mother passed, with the specific warmth of someone who had identified a target and was patient enough to approach it slowly. I knew my father was lonely in the way that men of his generation are lonely after loss, quietly, without complaint, in ways that made them vulnerable to the first person who offered consistent attention. I knew she had married him within 14 months of their first date, and that my father had told me, with the particular careful phrasing of a man trying to reassure someone he could see was worried, that she made him feel less alone. I had accepted that. I had kept my reservations to myself because he was my father, and he was happy, and I was not going to be the person who took that from him. What I had not known, what I would not know until I was sitting on his bedroom floor 3 weeks after his funeral, going through a box of his belongings that had been brought to me by his neighbor because Margaret had locked the house while the estate was in dispute, was that my father had known everything too. He had just been waiting for the right moment to tell me. The phone was in the box. An old Samsung, cracked on one corner, charged to 11% when I turned it on. There was one video in the camera roll, 43 minutes long. Recorded on the 14th of February, 6 weeks before he died, 3 days before he went into the hospice facility for the last time. I watched it sitting on my bedroom floor with my back against the bed frame. And when it was over, I sat in the dark for a long time, and then I called my attorney, and I said, I need you to come in tomorrow morning. I have something you need to see. Before I take you through what was in that video and what happened in the 4 months after I found it, tell me where you're watching from right now. Drop it in the comments, I read every single one. Subscribe to Karma Archives before we go any further, because what my father had been quietly building in the final months of his life is the part of the story that makes everything else make sense. Now let me take you back to the beginning. Because to understand what he recorded, you need to understand what he had figured out. My father's name was Roberto Vasquez. He came to this country from Mexico at 22 with construction skills, a work ethic that I have never seen matched in any professional environment since, and the specific stubborn optimism of someone who had decided that the only direction worth moving was forward. He built his landscaping business over 30 years, slowly, without shortcuts, the way he did everything. By the time I was in high school, it had 8 full-time employees and contracts with 3 commercial properties, and a client list of residential customers who had been with him for a decade or more because he showed up exactly when he said he would and charged exactly what he quoted and never once cut a corner. He was 61 when my mother passed. The cancer was fast, 9 months from diagnosis to the end, and my father absorbed the loss with the same quiet determination he applied to everything. He did not collapse. He kept working. He called me every Sunday. He went to Massachusetts. He was sad in a way that was real and deep and that he carried without complaint because that was who he was. Margaret entered his life at a charity fundraiser 16 months after my mother's death. She was 53, recently divorced, well-dressed in the specific way of someone who has learned to present well on a limited budget. She was warm and attentive and remembered everything my father told her and called it love. My father called it the same thing because he was a man who believed people were who they appeared to be until they demonstrated otherwise. They married 14 months after they met. I was a bridesmaid because my father asked me to be, and because I loved him, and because my reservations were exactly that, mine, quiet, unspoken. I smiled in every photograph. I gave a toast. I went home and I told myself that whatever happened, he was happy, and that happiness at 63, after what he had been through, was not nothing. The diagnosis came 8 months into the marriage. Pancreatic cancer. Stage 3. The prognosis was what it was. My father's oncologist spoke in timelines measured in months rather than years, and my father listened and nodded and came home and called me and said, Mija, I need to tell you something. And I need you to stay calm while I do. He stayed calm. I was less successful. What happened in the 14 months between the diagnosis and his death is a story I will not tell in full here because parts of it belong only to me. What I will tell you is that during those 14 months, my father paid attention. He had always paid attention. It was one of the things that had made him a good businessman, the ability to watch people and understand what they actually wanted underneath what they said they wanted. And what he watched in those 14 months was Margaret. He watched her make phone calls in rooms she thought he couldn't hear. He watched her have conversations with her adult son, a man named Derek, who had visited twice in 4 years of marriage, that stopped when my father entered the room. He watched her ask questions about the business's assets and the property's current market value and the outstanding balance on the mortgage with the specific systematic interest of someone building a financial picture. He watched her suggest, gently and with great apparent care, that he update his estate documents, that the will he had written 7 years ago was outdated, that they should see an attorney together, that it would give them both peace of mind. He did not update his will. He told her the attorney visits were scheduled. He rescheduled them 4 times. And in the meantime, he did something that I did not know about until I watched 43 minutes of video on a cracked Samsung phone on the floor of my bedroom. He built a record. The video begins with my father adjusting the phone against a stack of books on his nightstand. The lighting is the warm lamp light of his bedroom, the lamp I had grown up seeing in that room, the one with the ceramic base my mother had bought at a market in Oaxaca the year before I was born. He looks tired in the video. He had been tired for months by that point. But his voice is clear and his eyes are focused, and he speaks with the deliberate pace of someone who has thought carefully about every word before saying it. He begins by saying my name, Elena. And then he says, I want to make sure you know what I know. Because I might not have enough time to tell you in person, and this is too important to leave to chance. Then he talks for 42 minutes. He describes the phone calls he overheard. He describes specific conversations, dates, locations in the house where he was standing, what was said, and who said it. He describes a conversation between Margaret and her son Derek, in which Derek asked about the business, specifically whether it could be sold quickly or whether there would be complications. And Margaret said there would be some complications, but that she was working on them. My father had been standing in the hallway outside the kitchen listening to this conversation. He says in the video that he had been going to get a glass of water and had stopped because something in her tone was wrong. He describes finding paperwork. Not dramatic discovery, mundane discovery. A folder in the filing cabinet that contained documents he had not filed and had not seen. He describes them specifically, a notarized letter purportedly from him authorizing Margaret to act as his legal representative in all estate matters, dated to a period before his diagnosis when he was in full health and had signed no such thing. A draft property transfer document. A financial power of attorney he had not signed. He had not confronted her with any of it. He had photographed everything with the phone. He had put the folder back exactly as he found it. And then he had made an appointment with his own attorney, not the one he and Margaret had discussed visiting together, but a different one, privately, without telling her. And he had updated his will to include specific protections and had made a recorded video statement because, he says in the video, in his careful, unhurried voice, the video was harder to dispute than a piece of paper. He ends the video by saying my name again. He says, I am sorry I did not tell you sooner. I did not want to worry you while I was still here. I thought I had more time. And then he says, the phone is in the box with the blue lid. I told Carlos to make sure you get it. Give him my thanks. Carlos was his neighbor of 12 years. Carlos had shown up at my door 3 weeks after the funeral with a cardboard box and a look on his face that I understood, when I watched the video, had been carrying something I didn't yet know he was carrying. I sat in the dark for a long time after the video ended. And then I picked up my phone and I called my attorney. The attorney's name was Patricia Mendez. She had been recommended to me by a colleague 2 years earlier for a completely unrelated matter and had impressed me enough that I had kept her number. She specialized in estate law and civil litigation and had the particular manner of someone who had spent 20 years watching families destroy themselves over money and had developed a specific, steady patience with all of it. She answered on the second ring. I told her what I had found. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, bring me the phone tomorrow morning. Don't send any clips. Don't share it with anyone. Don't tell anyone outside this conversation that it exists. Can you do that? I said I could. She said, I also need you to send me whatever estate filing Margaret has made. And I need the name of the attorney she used. I sent her everything that evening. She reviewed the video and the documents overnight. When I walked into her office the following morning, she was already at her desk with a legal pad full of notes. She said, Elena, your father understood exactly what he was doing when he recorded this. A video statement of this nature, specific, detailed, dated, recorded in his own home by a competent adult, is admissible in probate proceedings. It establishes his state of mind, his knowledge of the circumstances, and his explicit wishes. Combined with the photographs he took of the documents he found, what you have here is the beginning of a fraud case, not just an estate dispute. I asked her to explain the difference. She said, an estate dispute is a disagreement about interpretation. A fraud case is a claim that someone deliberately misrepresented facts or forged documents to obtain assets they were not entitled to. The notarized letter your father described, the one authorizing Margaret as his legal representative, needs to be examined by a handwriting expert and a notary authentication specialist. If it's forged, we're not talking about civil probate. We're talking about fraud and potentially criminal referral. I asked what we needed to do first. She said, file a motion to contest the estate claim immediately, before anything is transferred or liquidated. That freezes everything, the house, the business assets, the bank accounts, while the court examines the legitimacy of Margaret's claim. Then we get the documents authenticated. And we submit the video. I said, file it. I want to be honest about the weeks between filing the motion and the first hearing. They were the strangest weeks of my life. My father had been dead for less than 2 months. I was grieving him in the normal way, the way that is not normal at all, the way that ambushes you in grocery stores and during phone calls and at 2 in the morning when you reach for your phone to call someone who is no longer there. And underneath the grief, I was doing something that required the opposite of grief softness. I was building a case. Gathering evidence. Meeting with Patricia. Reviewing documents. Learning things about a woman I had tolerated for 4 years that made the tolerance feel like a failure of instinct. Margaret had retained an attorney of her own, a man named Howard Fine who had a practice that specialized in estate work and who sent communications to Patricia that were measured and professional and that conveyed, between the lines, the particular confidence of someone who believed their client's position was strong. He had not yet seen the video. Patricia submitted the video to the court as part of our evidentiary package in week 4. Simultaneously, she had submitted the photographs of the documents to a forensic document examiner, a retired FBI specialist who now worked in private practice and who had examined the notarized letter authorizing Margaret as Roberto's legal representative. The examiner's report came back in week 6. The signature on the notarized letter was not my father's. The notary stamp was legitimate, the notary was real, licensed, and currently practicing. But the signature beneath it was not Roberto Vasquez's. The letter had been signed by someone else and notarized without the required in-person verification. The forensic examiner was prepared to testify to this, with a confidence level he rated at 96%. Patricia called me the morning the report arrived. She said, "Elena, this just became a criminal matter." And then, at the beginning of month 2 of our contest, something happened that I had not anticipated, and that changed the shape of everything. Margaret filed a counter-motion claiming that my father had been mentally incompetent at the time of the video recording, that the 43-minute statement had been made by a man who was medicated, confused, and subject to undue influence from a daughter who had never accepted his marriage. She was claiming my father didn't know what he was saying, that the video was the product of a sick and manipulated mind. I want to tell you what it felt like to read that filing. I want to tell you because I think if you have ever had someone take the most real thing you have, the most honest, clear, specific expression of a person you loved, and try to reframe it as the ravings of a confused old man, you will understand exactly what it felt like. It felt like a second loss. Cleaner than the first in some ways, because it had a target. But real and sharp, and for 2 days I carried it before I was able to set it down and go back to work. Patricia's response was methodical. She obtained the medical records from my father's final months of outpatient care, records that documented his cognitive status as assessed by his oncologist, his palliative care nurse, and 2 independent physicians. Every assessment described a man who was physically declining but cognitively intact. Sharp-oriented, fully aware of his circumstances. His oncologist, a woman who had known him for 14 months and had documented their conversations in careful detail, was prepared to testify that Roberto Vasquez had been one of the most clear-eyed patients she had treated in 20 years of oncology practice. She also obtained a statement from Carlos, my father's neighbor, who described the conversation in which my father had given him the box, specifically, clearly, with instructions 4 days before entering the hospice facility. Carlos described my father's manner as calm, purposeful, and completely coherent. He said my father had told him, "I need you to make sure Elena gets this box. Don't give it to anyone else. Not even Margaret. Especially not Margaret." Carlos had kept the box in his garage for 3 weeks, in exactly the condition my father had left it, because my father had asked him to and because Carlos had known Roberto Vasquez for 12 years and would have done anything the man asked. The hearing was in month 4. I want to tell you about the moment Margaret's attorney presented her counter-motion argument to the judge. I want to tell you about it because it was the moment I understood what my father had understood when he made the video, that the truth, documented specifically and stored safely, is very difficult to argue against in a courtroom. Howard Fine presented the incompetency argument with professional thoroughness. He submitted records. He cited the medication my father had been taking in his final months, standard palliative care medication, the kind that manages pain without impairing cognition in the manner he was suggesting. He was careful and articulate and argued his client's position as well as it could be argued. Then Patricia submitted the response. The oncologist's records. The palliative care assessments. Carlos's statement. The forensic document examiner's report on the notarized letter. And the video. The judge watched 22 minutes of the video in chambers. I was not present for that. I sat in the corridor outside the courtroom on a wooden bench, and I thought about my father adjusting the phone against a stack of books on his nightstand, and his voice saying my name, and the lamp with the ceramic base from the market in Oaxaca that my mother had brought home the year before I was born. The judge rejected the incompetency claim. Margaret's estate filing was dismissed with prejudice, meaning it could not be refiled. The house reverted to the estate as described in my father's updated will, which had been executed 4 months before his death with his own private attorney, witnessed by 2 people who had no connection to Margaret. The business assets were inventoried and preserved. The bank accounts were unfrozen and properly distributed. The notarized letter, the forged one, was referred to the district attorney's office for criminal investigation. I am not going to tell you what happened with that referral, because it is still ongoing, and I have been advised to say nothing beyond acknowledging that it exists. What I will tell you is that Margaret Vasquez no longer lives in my father's house. What I will tell you is that the landscaping business, the one he built from a truck and a lawnmower over 30 years, is now being run by one of his longest-serving employees under a management agreement that will eventually transfer ownership to the employees who built it alongside him, because that is what my father's updated will specified and because that was the kind of man he was. And what I will tell you is that the phone is on my nightstand now. The cracked Samsung with the ceramic case. I charged it fully. I have watched the video 4 times, and I do not think I will watch it again for a long time because watching it is still the closest thing I have to hearing his voice, and the distance between that and the real thing is something I am not yet ready to measure too precisely. But I know it is there. When I need it, it is there. Before I go, I want to say something about what my father did, not as a legal strategy, but as an act of love. He was dying. He was in pain. He had limited time and limited energy and 1,000 things that would have been easier to attend to than building a 43-minute evidentiary record on a cracked phone in his bedroom. He could have let it go. He could have told himself it was too complicated, that he was too tired, that maybe he had misread things, that maybe Margaret would do the right thing without being forced to. He knew better. And he loved me enough to do the hard thing when he had the least capacity to do anything hard at all. I think about that a lot. The people who truly protect us are not always the ones who are loudest about it or most visibly present. Sometimes they are the ones who quietly do the necessary thing in a spare hour on a Tuesday evening, who say your name into a phone camera and tell you what they know, who trust that you will find the box. If you have elderly parents or grandparents or anyone in your life whose estate could be subject to the kind of thing I have described, have the conversation. The real one about documents and wills and who has access to what. Not because you are suspicious of everyone. Because love, sometimes, looks like a recorded video on a charged phone in a box with a blue lid in a neighbor's garage. Your name in that video is the most important thing your person can give you. Leave a comment and tell me, has someone in your life ever protected you in a way you only found out about after they were gone? Or have you ever discovered something that changed the entire shape of what you thought you knew? Drop it in the comments. I read every single one. Subscribe to Karma Archives. Every day there is a new story. True revenge stories, real American workplace drama, family betrayal with satisfying endings, r/ProRevenge style, narrated daily for audiences who believe the truth deserves to be heard. Karma always keeps receipts. My father proved that. Subscribe. I'll see you next time.